Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here, and I'm very pleased to bring in our guest, who is Frank Britt, who is the CEO at Penn Foster, the leading provider of EdTech-enabled workforce solutions for students and employers in training and selection of frontline workers. Frank is a thought leader with a unique perspective that focuses on frequently underemphasized aspects of the workforce and new economy skills in the 21st century. I had the pleasure of sitting in on an interview with Frank at the Holland IQ Global Summit in New York, and I was impressed by his perspective and advocacy for a middle-skilled workforce. And I'm very happy to welcome Frank to Trending in Education. Frank, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So can we begin by talking a little bit about what is Penn Foster? Its origin story is super interesting. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. And then maybe share with us what Penn Foster's mission is today.
Certainly. Why don't I start with the present and then tag back to the original notion of what Penn Foster was and is. Penn Foster is an organization today that is premised on the notion that there's a very large, meaningful percentage of our workforce, so-called middle-skilled workers, that are in need of ongoing training, upskilling, and alike, but lack either access and or affordability to getting the kinds of support they need to mobilize in their careers. And so the Penn Foster Institution's charter is to try to help people make the thoughtful choices for them at this moment in a changing economy and a changing workforce, and put them on a path for economic mobility, skill attainment, and ultimately greater empowerment to take better control of wherever they go with their careers. Penn Foster itself, the enterprise, is of some scale. We're, I think, the largest or among the largest platform companies in the country that explicitly and exclusively focuses on the middle skill workforce, or what some people call the frontline workforce. It's a part of the economy that I think is underappreciated in terms of its scale and scope. There's about 130 million adults at work in the United States, half of whom are actually so-called middle skilled workers, which are roughly defined by the Department of Labor as people with an associate degree or less. And so that's the workforce that we're preoccupied with. We tend to think of the education system at large as a $1.3 trillion market in the United States. You had K-12 on one end, higher education the other. And there's this large opaque market in the middle, roughly $200 to $300 billion, according to some estimates. And we call that the workforce development marketplace. And that's where we're most preoccupied. As to how we got here because way back a long time ago, 129 years ago, there was a series of mining accidents in Pennsylvania. And this fellow, Thomas Foster, came to realize that one of the root causes was a lack of training. And so thus was born the International Correspondence School, which sent out its first book by mail in 1890. And through its history, its very storied history, the International Correspondence School, which then became ICS for most of the 20th century, has educated, literally tens of millions of people. But the consistent narrative from really its inception is focused on the blue collar workforce, as it was once known. And to the present, we've remained true to that brand idea that there's another half of the economy that needs support. And we're an organization that's committed to trying to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's super interesting. And I was mentioning when we were setting up here that I think I've fallen prey to the same trap that's out there when thinking about education and the workforce writ large, is to focus on maybe the top end of the workforce, the most highly skilled, in demand, the engineering, computer science, data science, all the new hotness, all the trendier things that folks talk a lot about. But what I found really interesting about your perspective is that you're focusing on workers who in many ways are the front lines of the new wave of automation that we're all anticipating. And I've heard you talk in a really interesting way about the future of work. And I'd love to hear from your perspective what people frequently get wrong and perhaps what they get right when thinking about the future of work, and then specifically thinking about the future of work as it relates to middle-skilled workers.
Well, I think the first thing they quote get wrong is they just don't appreciate the scale and scope of the size of this market. I mean, we got almost half the workforce in the United States are middle skilled, and while there's lots of apocalyptic narratives regarding automation, which we'll likely come back to later, the reality is if you were to do a scan of the job openings in the United States today, about half the job openings in the United States today are actually middle skilled related jobs. Now, those jobs are going through, like all jobs, quite a bit of transformation. But just because the manufacturing facility has more automation, it doesn't mean the job doesn't exist. It just means the job design exists. So what we see happening is the underlying job designs are absolutely changing through cognitive augmentation, the use of machine learning and the like. But the jobs themselves, not in all cases, but in many cases, will remain. We've just finished a very sizable proprietary study, for example, in manufacturing, which is a very topical issue in the mainstream media. And what we found, this is an empirical study coupled with hundreds of interviews with employers. It is the case that there is a modest contraction of the number of manufacturing jobs in the United States. However, if you look at it from our perspective, which is the need for upskilling and training, interestingly, that number actually goes up in that context, because while the number of humans that are needing to be reskilled is modestly declining, the magnitude of the reskilling is actually growing. And so it nets out to be, from an indexing perspective, more aggregate demand for upskilling and reskilling, even in the manufacturing sector, which would be kind of a typical target of people talking about the future of work and jobs going away. So I think the general meta miss is big market that has real opportunity, but it also has unique complexities. There are academic, financial, and emotional design considerations. If you think about what is the optimal learning experience for this particular cohort, that is very different than serving a traditional white collar professional. And so part of why we've been able to carve out to some degree a sort of a positional scarcity, and by that I mean an institution that occupies a part of the larger education economy that is somewhat underserved and historically ignored, is that there just aren't that many other institutions of our scale that are preoccupied with this unique cohort of creating solutions for them that help them achieve both their financial, academic, and ultimately career-related objectives. So I think that's kind of the big miss is it's a big challenge, a big opportunity. The good news is, and we can talk more about this, there are new voices emerging in the ecosystem that are shining the light on this part of the economy. And I think it might be a good segue to talk about what are those new voices, in particular the voice of the employer, which, as you know from our conversations, is really becoming the megaphone that's going to change not just the larger education system, but particularly the narrative relative to the middle skilled workforce.
Yeah, very much in line with the direction that I think we should take. And just to sort of emphasize your point, one thing we've talked about a lot on this show is the idea of, the whole learner, the whole student, trying to understand folks within their context, trying to understand, you mentioned the word emotional, the idea that these middle skilled employees are demands on their time, demands on their even their economic situation are pretty unique. And I think that's where both being empathetic to that workforce is something I've very much been hearing from you throughout my exposure to your thinking, but also, pivoting to what you're talking about, the idea that modern modern organizations are thinking about this cohort in a very different way and are partnering with companies like Penn Foster to figure out how do we upskill, outskill, reskill this cohort. So I would like to pivot maybe towards your predictions. We're a trend spotting show and we love predictions, and 2020 in many ways is the year of the prediction. So good job by you for having 5 predictions for the world of work in 2020. But I'd love to explore those and maybe get into some of the specifics that you reference there, and just talking through them real quickly, and then I think we can dive back in. So the first is learning to work becomes working to learn. So we'll dig in a little on that. The second is the apprenticeship of the future. So the idea that apprenticeships are a really old model that is now being recast in the context of the 21st century. The rise of outskilling, which is an interesting term, and we have talked on this show about the Amazon Career Choice Program, which is one of your examples there. The potential of first mile services, which I like, also in terms of opening up the perspective there, so that it's not, frequently we think about the last mile and just-in-time training, but the first mile is perhaps an underrepresented aspect of the needs here, where just getting folks onboarded and ready enough so that they're able to engage with their education, I think is a really interesting space. And then the last of the five is getting unstuck in the middle. So, which is sort of what we've been talking about really throughout. So really interesting post here that we'll share out from Frank and team at Penn Foster, but it's a lot to chew on there, Frank. So I don't know, maybe you want to tackle them in order or tackle them in whatever way you think makes the most sense. But maybe we'll begin by talking about learning to work is becoming working to learn.
Yeah. So the first of those themes, as you note, is about the changing social compact that exists between the individual and the employee. For the last several years, what we've seen is an emergence of a new conversation regarding, in a near full employment market, how do you compete for talent, again, for the middle skilled workforce as opposed to the knowledge workers? And as we deconstruct that from what is the employer value proposition to the employee, one of the obvious observations that has become somewhat self-evident at this point to any progressive organization that hires at scale this cohort is that historically the usual factors of wages and culture and obviously benefits and the like, those are all very important and remain essential. But what's starting to happen, fortunately, and not a minute too late, is that there's a recognition that while training about the job you're doing is always essential, what has been missing historically, in contrast to the white collar professionals, has been any kind of commitment to upskilling folks as it relates to their career mobility. So beyond the actual task at large within a store context or a plant context, what are the skills and investments you're making in my future so that I can either stay in the role I'm in if I'm satisfied, but I have mobility, whether it be vertically or laterally in my career. And so what we've seen is companies starting to really embrace that idea at scale. And if you take firms like McDonald's, for example, they even speak about the fact that as opposed to offering what I just said, which is get a job here and you'll get opportunities for selected upskilling programs, they're now even going beyond that, saying effectively, the reason to come work at McDonald's is to get the learning. And by the way, we'll pay you while you're here. Now, of course, they likely wouldn't take the job if they weren't getting paid. But the general notion here is that it's a subtle but fairly profound shift in orientation that says that the way you're going to underwrite and finance your schooling is going to be through working. And historically, at best, it's been an incremental benefit, although generally not available to the middle skill workforce. It's never been positioned as you should come learn and then you can make some money as part of it. That's a very different narrative, which it takes a significant amount of institutional commitment. But what reflects is that the misperception that this middle skill workforce doesn't have the ambition that a white collar professional has, that's nothing could be farther from the truth. If you live and breathe and spend time with, as we do day to day, with folks at this part of the economy, the dynamics they live in their life, the drag coefficients they have to encounter are very different than ours. It could be childcare with scarcity. It could be access to transportation. It could be flexible hours in their job. So these folks have as much or more grit and resiliency than, frankly, I know I have, and you might have as well. And so I think this idea of embracing this cohort, not with pity and sympathy, but with affirmation and presumption of an aspiration that they have in their lives, and really framing learning as a primary part of the value proposition. That's what Walmart's doing. That's what Amazon's doing. That's what many leading employers, EmployBridge, which is one of the largest staffing companies, along with really many big companies at this stage of the game, are all embracing this idea that if you really want to compete for talent and middle skills, you have to offer more than just wages and a safe working environment. And we think that foreshadows a very different narrative on the access and opportunity that the middle skill population is going to have to taking, again, better control of their economic futures.
Yeah. Fantastic stuff there, and it reminds me of the old saw of the last 10 years, which is, every company needs to be a technology company. I think what you're pointing out here, and we've talked about it many times on this show, is that every organization really needs to be a learning organization. And if you're not able to unlock the potential of your workforce, you're actually at a disadvantage to the organizations that are really thinking strategically about the opportunity there. And then in particular, the gaps around the middle skilled workforce, the fact that it makes up half of the entirety of the US workforce on the one hand, and that the skills gaps that emerge even through automation are frequently focused on this middle skilled space. And in some ways, it seems like we're almost under leveraging the opportunity here, which I think is a real insight, and I do appreciate you putting this thinking out there, because I think it has helped evolve my thinking.
Can I just add one comment to that? Just
Sure,
if
please.
you were to put your deep analytical rigor hat on this topic, there's about $22 billion a year spent on tuition reimbursement in the United States from corporations, and less than 5% of that is spent on the middle skill cohort. Now, that's not to suggest that knowledge workers don't need to continue to remain current and upskill, but if you think about the uncertainty in the economy, the rate of skills obsolescence, the risk of automation, you would think that there'd be a much greater emphasis in terms of investments in those types of programs around the middle skilled. And the good news is that is exactly what we're starting to see at leading employers like Walmart, Disney, Lowe's, and others, that they are in fact re-optimizing their tuition reimbursement dollars to make it available to the middle skill cohort to complement the investments in traditional training and 21st century training that are needed for them in their jobs themselves. I think it's also a perhaps back to the big five themes, an interesting segue to a second somewhat counterintuitive prediction, which is what we call the rise of outskilling. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just about a week or so ago in the Future of Everything section that used the term outskilling, which is a phrase that we use. And it's counterintuitive in that to the extent you're going to make a decision to underwrite investments in upskilling of the workforce, the premise historically has been, although not often enough as we've established, but the premise has been that that person would stay longer and that person would therefore drive greater long-term impact and productivity within the employer. Is a fair trade of, if I invest in your capabilities, it seems more than reasonable that I would get some return from that. But what's starting to happen, which is this notion of outskilling, is as bigger corporations look at the long term and they see some of the more fundamental shifts in their workforce design, they're confronted with this interesting ethical dilemma, which is if I know 2 or 3 years from today that call center I have in Des Moines is likely to be half its size, what is my obligation to take preemptive steps to help them, because I do actually need that workforce today. And so rather than the old school 1980s, we'll make a big announcement and lay off people, that model doesn't work anymore, because the weaponization of social media is such that if you don't treat people respectfully and responsibly, particularly in this so-called post-capitalist world, you're going to get scorched from the media and from, depending if you're a consumer business or a B2B business, a very amplified platform environment across all the different social platforms. So what we're starting to see is employers like, for example, Amazon saying, our proposition to you is come work here, do a good job, be paid fairly, but we'll upskill you to leave eventually Amazon and help you secure employment outside of the Amazon company at large, and now likely be part of the larger Amazon ecosystem of suppliers and customers, but you will actually be an employee somewhere else. So they're having the longer term horizon that says not everyone in the long run is going to be a good fit, but they're good people. They need to be respected, and the dignity of work matters. And so we're going to help underwrite that. And we see that as a second big mega trend that was, I think, very well articulated by Lauren in the recent Wall Street Journal article.
Yeah, and I think that one's also really interesting when you think about, I've heard you talk, and we did a show a little while back about the Business Roundtable's memo about social impact, thinking about social justice, and thinking about, how providing a social good to your workforce is in many ways becoming table stakes to stay relevant in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think in some ways, I think following some of your thinking has helped evolve and sort of flesh out my thinking. But it does seem like, just like I was saying before, every organization needs to be a learning organization. I think also thinking about doing good for your workforce, to your point, even if they're not necessarily going to be a 20, 30 year career within your organization, is still ultimately a net benefit for both the organization and the individuals. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your thinking on that.
Well, we think of, first of all, Penn Foster as a social enterprise, because our notion is that if we are successful in what we do, we will drive long-term wage gains, and that has a whole set of both primary and second order social impacts on families and communities. In fact, all of our financial sponsors at Penn Foster are in fact social impact investment funds. So if you look at someone like the Bain Capital Double Impact Fund or the Prudential Impact Fund, those are the folks that are the underwriters of Penn Foster's business. And so by natural extension, this idea of purpose and profit is very much at the DNA of what we do and how we think about it. There are some, as you know, very thoughtful and very influential people who are calling for companies to take more responsibility for ensuring their workers have the right standard of living. And I think there's a general recognition that over the last 10 years, the workforce that we're talking about, the so-called middle skilled, have had wage stagnation, and they have grave concerns regarding the impact on technology and ultimately uncertainty about their future. And that has started to manifest itself in lots of dimensions, politically and otherwise. And so we view companies moving now from the rhetoric and maybe the philanthropic oriented approach of social corporate responsibility to one where they're recognizing that in this sort of post-capitalist world, they need to take a much more directive set of engagement priorities. And in so doing, they're making upskilling a very fundamental one, because interestingly, beyond healthcare and physical security, wage sustainability and wage security is arguably, one of the three most important things for a vibrant life where you can contribute and not have the very challenging risks of poverty and incarceration, those sorts of things. So education is a positive correlation to health outcomes, and obviously a positive correlation to societal outcomes at large. And so we see companies really leaning in on that, and we applaud it, A, because it's corporate social responsibility changing in the best sense, and B, it's very much aligned to the DNA of what we believe. Our enterprise design is unique as an institution. We do not accept student loans. We think that the student loan model is premised on some assumptions that we necessarily find challenging. Most notable one is the issue of where risk should be assigned in the value chain. And if you and I have a relationship and we're executing a transaction, the question of where the risk in that relationship should be borne is always sort of at the core of the exchange. And obviously, if you exchange capital directly, the premise is that there's going to be a fair return on that investment. But if you think about a student loan, what essentially you're doing is asking a person to believe in the return on investment that has yet to be realized. And hopefully it does. And we certainly encourage anyone who has that orientation to lean in and do that. Having said that, our model is such that we ask you to pay as you go. So if you keep using the service, you should continue to pay. But if for whatever reason you stop using it, either because you find that the product doesn't match your needs, or life gets in the way, or a variety of other very legitimate reasons why things don't always work out, we don't think that we should have this asymmetry of risk, and therefore we have a pay-as-you-go model. And when you finish at Penn Foster, even if you didn't complete, your obligations are pro rata to the amount of the program you've utilized, as opposed to what often happens is, quite regrettably, that the person is not only not able to complete the program for good or not good reasons, but they're also then had the double effect of they don't actually have the resources because they still have the student loan obligation. So all of which is to say, it's an example of how we've tried to design into our enterprise this idea of purpose with a profit in that order. And it turns out in our enterprise, if we achieve higher purpose, we end up creating more profit, which we then reinvest in innovation to create more amplification, more access. And that's the flywheel that we think is very unique to this privatized approach to workforce development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting stuff. And it makes me think a bit about some of what I've seen from you as well around evolving past the binary thinking about sort of these monolithic degrees where, a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, we have a real crisis in the U.S. these days around the population who has some college and no degree. And could you talk a little bit about that? How in some ways, thinking about the sort of terminal, even an associate's degree, in some ways is somewhat limiting in its thinking because frequently the middle skilled employee needs to be more incremental in her thinking about how do I get the skills that I need, how do I stay job relevant, how do I upskill throughout my life, and certainly there's a place for associate's degrees and beyond. But I did think some of your perspective on this was enlightening to me, and I'd love to hear you share that with our listeners.
Yeah, well, I think that there's sort of two sides. There's the provider marketplace segmentation, and then there's the needs of the learner. From the needs of the learner perspective, which should always be the true north, if you embrace the notion, as we all should, because it's just empirical at this point, that we're all going to have 5, 7, 10 jobs in our career, then by definition, you would imagine that you would have to be intermittently upskilled in order to take those next subsequent jobs. If you're in the middle skilled part of the population, one might argue that that's even a more demonstrable set of step function changes. And so we're trying to create on-ramps to facilitate the idea that you're going to come in and out of the education economy over decades, not over years. So that's point one. Point two is, I think that if given a choice, obviously all things being equal, it's better to have a bachelor degree. The data in terms of wage gains and sustainability certainly support that. However, if you're not a bachelor degree holding person, let's call you a sub-bachelor degree, there are a series of traditional definitions of success, which is the quote degree, which have tremendous merit, but perhaps in and of themselves are an incomplete perspective. And so we're trying to move the model towards more of a skill attainment orientation, so that if you can essentially deconstruct the learning into skills, and there's a robust taxonomy of skills, the future person who comes for employment, at least in the middle skill part of the population, may not come with their first order narrative being, I have an associate degree or I don't, which is a more conventional notion. They may be coming saying, I've built a portfolio of skills that have been verified through both traditional theoretical academic training coupled with work-based learning or experiential-based learning. And we think that if you were to look at a middle skilled person's resume in 5 years, the idea of where you got your degree is going to be very second order to the degree to which you can affirm and prove empirically and objectively that you have skills. So we think skill attainment is going to change the way conversations happen. And therefore, what you will see is effectively a deconstruction of the traditional hierarchy of degrees, diplomas, and alike, and certifications into a new axis, which is this skills axis that we think will be very disruptive to the marketplace from the provider perspective, because the providers have always been very neatly bucketed and organized because that's the way the regulators of the education economy have required. They make very clear and important distinctions in terms of accreditation between a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, an associate degree, a certification, which in their own right, there is fidelity to thinking about that, but not to the point where it becomes a rate limiting factor to the voice of opportunity, which is again takes us back to the employer. From the employer's perspective, they don't really care whether I went to Westchester Community College or Bunker Hill Community College. What they care about is, does Frank Grid have the 10 skills that I need in order to do the job? And so that becomes the disruptor to the traditional accreditation-oriented approach. And so the good news, or bad news, depending on your perspective, is there is an emerging recognition amongst providers that there's a blurring of segments in the education system. And so that's why you see some of the bigger players starting to think about how they move to different parts of the market. And the education providers that we know today will look very different 5 or 10 years from now. Although in many cases, the winners will still be the winners. They'll be offering very different types of programs with very different types of credentialing underpinnings and fidelity to them, because that's what the marketplace is going to demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it just, we're moving through this whole fascinating conversation. Really, again, thank you for joining. Just to make this a little more concrete for folks, I remember at the Holland IQ Summit, you provided some examples around specific middle skilled jobs, and can you choose an example of a middle skilled job that is relevant and can kind of put the population that you're talking about and the opportunity space that you're describing into context for folks? The example that I remember was veterinary technicians. Can you provide a little more color around which middle skilled jobs are really growing and why, so that folks can kind of get some specificity to their thinking about the space?
Absolutely. So if you look at it from, let's call it the more advanced middle skill roles, they would commonly be credentials that are objectively attained, that oftentimes, not always, have national exams to verify proficiency, and commonly involve some level of externship of hundreds of hours or more. So some of the examples, at least in the Penn Foster portfolio, in the animal health world, as you mentioned, vet technician is one of the fastest growing jobs in the country. The rate limiting factor to animal hospital growth in the United States is actually there aren't enough vet techs, there aren't enough veterinarians. And it's a multi-billion-dollar market. Consumers spend lots of money, and the vet tech becomes essentially the physician assistant or physician assistant equivalent in an animal context, or a nurse practitioner equivalent. If you look at pharmacy technician, would be another classic example. Obviously, the mega trends on healthcare are self-evident, 19% of the GDP. There are 3 or 4 different occupations that we particularly view as important growth opportunities in middle skilled for allied health, including the pharmacy technician, the home health aide, certified nursing assistant would be 3 examples. In the manufacturing context, the manufacturing economy continues to change, but as I mentioned, our most recent proprietary research affirms that there are many, many manufacturing jobs that there's an acute shortage due to really multiple factors. One is the so-called silver tsunami, where in some of the plants in Indiana, 30 or 40% of the people who work in the plant could actually retire, or qualified and eligible to retire in the next 24 months. So you've got a massive supply-demand imbalance, and you have some very different kinds of skills that you need to have. And what's interesting about those roles I cited, in every case, they not only require tacit domain knowledge, so-called theoretical academic knowledge, in all cases, they also require an applied knowledge. So in the case of the vet tech, to complete a program with national certification, in your second semester, you'd have to do a 240-hour externship in an animal hospital, and then in your 4th semester, 100 hours. There's sort of corollaries for that in several of the other areas I cited, such as pharmacy technician. And then the last thing I might mention, which takes us a little bit back to the earlier conversation, is that while it may be the case that you want to be a welder, which, by the way, is a very lucrative job, and there's a massive supply-demand imbalance, this is where non-traditional credentialing starts to play a role. Because if you and I both started down the welding path and you took 3 of the big modules and I dropped out of the first one, and then ultimately you finished the whole thing, whether you did 3 modules or 6 and got to completion, even if you just did the 3, you obviously are far more qualified to work in a job environment than I would be. And so what we would do in Penn Foster's model is we would offer you skill attainment badges. And so you would go to the employer and say, I've secured badges in these 3 domains that are part of the larger architecture of being a welder. It could be, safety management, metallurgy, some basic things, but maybe not the advanced status. But the point is, the current model of education is so unrealistically binary, as if the fact that you didn't go all the way to the end inherently makes you incapable is not just practically true. If you took 150 hours of welding versus 250, it may be the case you didn't finish, but you clearly have more market value than you would have had otherwise. And so what we're trying to push is a combination of a completion narrative, because that's always the right idea, but also a skill attainment narrative that says we should acknowledge and reward and celebrate people who gain skills, even if they didn't go, quote, all the way to the traditional end. And that's where the education system's out of sync with the labor market, because the labor market values skills. The academic system has a more binary definition, and we think that's one of the things that's going to be disrupted over time because the voice of the employers will become so much more pronounced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And I think highlights maybe the misalignment of focus at times that, frequently folks who are quote unquote thought leaders in education and the future of work tend to think of people like themselves, people who have advanced degrees, who have, access to income and convenience in their lives. And frequently that then leads to a bit of a head in the sand sort of mindset around where the real opportunity is, or at least one of the big emerging opportunities in the next, say, 5 to 10 years is going to be around these middle skilled employees. And then also I do find it really, in some ways, heartening that it's not really the dystopian, the robots are coming for our jobs narrative. In many ways, the emerging technology, even the example of a veterinary technician, that's going to require more skilling, more reskilling of the human workforce as the automation gets better. And then when you talk about things like healthcare or animal health, there is always going to need to be that human layer because of the nature of the work. And that combined with the mission orientation and the concepts around the dignity of work that I think really certainly resonate with me, make your work super interesting to myself and hopefully to our listeners. Frequently, what we like to so you wanted to jump in?
I was just going to make one final comment because we had talked about just at least at a top line these 5 trends. One of the other trends, which links to a point you were just making, is there's often a discussion, as there should be, about last mile services of, is Johnny ready for job interviews? Does Johnny have a resume? Is Johnny on LinkedIn? And those are essential services for employment. But as you mentioned, this cohort of folks do have unique life challenges that in some sense are the same as ours, but are very different because they have different access to resources than we do, and oftentimes different degrees of freedom. And so the term that we use is first mile services. The first mile services are all the types of things that can get in the way of pursuing your career. It could be mental health services. It could be elder care. It could be navigating, a small legal matter. It could be transportation. These are all very practical constraints that impede a person from, quote, staying earnest to their commitment to school, not from lack of intention, but just because life gets in the way. So we're spending a fair amount of time thinking about how do we at scale, we serve over 100,000 adult learners a year. How do we scale first mile services in the same way that traditional institutions are mindful of trying to scale last mile services, which is not to say it's not important, aka last mile services, simply to say it doesn't really matter what happens at the end if you can't get started because your childcare broke down or you can't get tokens for the bus or you don't have food sustainability. And so we're trying to deal with some very fundamental issues on the Maslow hierarchy that are oftentimes presumed in a more classical white collar context, which speaks to your point of it's always important, if you are not like the people you service, to make sure that you have what you say, being proximate to the problem. You can be abstractly in support of something, but if you're not into the particulars, or if you're not proximate to the problem, because that's not your life, that you need to find ways and manufacture ways to be proximate. And in our case, because we deal with tens of thousands of learners, every week, we are proximate to the problem. So we hear and we listen and we understand these are the kind of challenges these folks have, and they need credible, scalable remedies. And that's one of the things that our brand stands for. We're trying to be an advocate for you, not just an educational institution.
Yeah, it definitely comes through in everything I've seen from you and from your organization. As we conclude here, Frank, we typically like to ask our guests, as an educational trend spotting show, are there broad trends that you're tracking that you think will be important to the future of learning in the 2020s? Pretty much everything we were discussing thus far, I think, would fall in line with that. But is there anything that we haven't talked about that you've been tracking or you think is important just to keep our eyes on as we're trying to understand where the future of learning is heading in, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think there's a lot of conventional answers that I claim no greater knowledge about than many other folks you have on the podcast. Maybe a non-traditional pathway into your question would be that if you look at the investment in education as a financial market perspective, as compared to, say, healthcare, it's actually a substantially under-indexed investment class. If you look at, there are trillions of dollars sitting on the sideline from pension funds and private equity funds and all these other types of financial instruments. There's a tremendous amount of money on the sidelines, and what they're seeking is a fair return. But to your earlier conversation, they're seeking a place to invest their monies where there's a social dimension to the return model, not just a financial return. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're going to see over time is a lot of these institutions are going to move into education. They're going to seek opportunities to fund both traditional and non-traditional providers. And so I think because of this influx of massive amounts of capital that's sitting on the sideline that people want to deploy for greater financial return and social purpose, I think you'll see a very different competitive set 5-10 years from now in the education system at large, at least in the middle skilled and the higher education bucket, because that capital needs to be put to good use. And when those folks start releasing those and deploying those dollars, they're going to fund a lot of nascent companies that either are early stage today or don't exist, and they're going to help transform some of the scaled providers that are out there. And I think an interesting way to frame it is that the financial market changes in terms of the allocation of capital might be the most important catalyst for innovation and education, because where there's capital, there's talent and innovation. And at historical levels, that hasn't always been the case, particularly in the middle skilled, which has been significantly underinvested in compared to K-12 and higher ed. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see a lot of changes from financial players coming in, particularly in the social impact world, and really changing what they seek from providers. And those providers are going to create very new classes of solutions for learners and ultimately for employers.
Great insight, and ending on an optimistic note in terms of in your prediction. So thanks again, Frank Britt, the CEO of Penn Foster, for joining us on Trending in Education. You are a wonderful guest, and hopefully our listeners were somewhat illuminated from the broadening of perspective that's provided by you, Frank. And if folks want to learn more about what you're talking about, or if they want to track these types of ideas, do you have any recommendations in terms of where they should go?
Well, we do a fair amount of thought leadership work at Penn Foster. So you can go to the Penn Foster blog called Foster EDU. Frankbritt.com is also a good place that houses a lot of the work that we do as a derivative of my work in the industry at large. And that's where most of the good Penn Foster related work ends up. I'm not by any means the only voice and thought leader at Penn Foster, far from it. But we think our role is to help elevate the conversation as much as to deliver value to our consumers. And so we like to think we offer some interesting, perhaps often non-traditional perspectives on the world of work and the world of education, and we sit at the nexus of both. So I'd probably check those places out.
Excellent. Thanks again, Frank, for your time. And for our listeners, we'll be back again soon on Trending in Education.